Welcome to Elemental Energy, the podcast where we discuss how to simplify decarbonization. Here, we will introduce emerging low-carbon energy technologies and give you insight on how to navigate and support the evolving energy landscape. It is our goal to develop content to give you confidence to help transition the market and make low-carbon energy reliable and affordable. I'm your host, Marcia Leonard. Welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode of Elemental Energy. I'm so thankful to have our current guest on today. And what we are going to be discussing today is emissions reduction, because let's be real, that's why this whole low carbon energy movement got started, is because we recognize the need to reduce emissions through our energy generation processes. So today we are going to talk about scope emissions. We're going to help define them, scopes 1 through 3. We're going to talk about methane and CO2 emissions. When we say emissions, we're going to make sure that people understand it's not just CO2. And then we're also going to talk about the future of the midstream industry and how we are starting to reduce emissions through the process in midstream. So I have brought on a very special guest who has spent near a decade with one of the majors, Kinder Morgan, in the pipeline industry. And his most recent endeavor is with a company called Project Canary, where he's going to help us define that mission even further. But their mission is to reduce emissions. So with all that being said, Patrick, welcome to Elemental Energy. I'm so thankful to have you here. Please go ahead and introduce yourself further.
Great, Marcia. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you and all your listeners. So to give you a little background on myself, I went to West Point, and graduating from there, I was an environmental engineer major, and then joined the Army, spent about 9 years in the Army after that, doing all sorts of engineering operations, both on the combat engineering side as well as the construction side. And I transferred out of the Army in 2014, and I moved into the energy industry. And during that time frame, I was really looking at doing something related to environmental engineering, something with the environment in mind, and came across the energy industry, started diving into it, and really fell in love with it, and moved into working as a project manager in oil and gas operations, everything from pipelines on the FERC regulated side to gas gathering in the unregulated market, and doing projects pretty much from the Rocky Mountains out to California, and then going all the way down into Texas and up into Canada. So spent a lot of time building facilities, pipelines, retrofitting facilities and pipelines, working with a lot of different operators and producers in that time, and doing everything from integrity work to the new build and modifications for like compressor stations, as well as pipelines for CO2, as well as natural gas. And seen a lot, and it's changed a lot. I'm sure we'll talk about it more as we go on. But I think as the environmental movement has been gaining more traction, not only in the energy industry, but just throughout the United States and the world as a whole, there's a lot more opportunities out there. And an opportunity came to work for Project Canary. And it was something that really aligned with me, my passions and goals, and gave me a great opportunity to jump on board and do some really good things with them that I'm super excited about.
Okay, so I have to ask the question, because you and I have a similar path when it comes down to being advocates for the environment. You hopefully recognize just how important pipelines are in the sustainability journey, right? Like it is one of the most sustainable things that we can do, in my mind, is to support pipelines, because think of how else we would be, running product if we didn't have pipelines.
Yes, that critical infrastructure is key to everything that we're doing and everywhere it needs to go. So without it, we couldn't operate or do the things that we need to do.
Exactly. Okay, I want to hear more about Project Canary's mission.
Okay. I would say Project Canary has the greatest mission statement ever. If you're not familiar with it, our mission statement is to give emissions the bird. So not only does that align with what we're doing, but obviously it matches with our mascot, so to say, and the canary itself. Obviously, it's related to the canary in the coal mine and everything from methane emissions up to what we're doing in CO2 and the rest of the kind of ESG space. So to dive into that a little bit more, our main mission, we are a SaaS company, so we're a software as a service provider. We truly focus on the data and the analytics and the high fidelity measurement that we are looking at as it relates to emissions in the oil and gas and energy industry as a whole. So our main goal is to reduce emissions, provide technologies, analytics, and capabilities to operators, stakeholders, government agencies that help us achieve our goals as a nation, as well as the goals of the individual players that are out there, the operators, producers. So we are gathering that data, refining it, analyzing it, showing what that proves and showing the accuracy related to it so they can use it to communicate internally or communicate externally what is actually going on. So I think it's a very important mission and a very important goal in what we're trying to achieve and getting that information out. I think Project Canary does a wonderful job in marketing, educating, pulling in subject matter experts from all different aspects of the industry, not just operators, not just regulators, but subject matter experts in specific fields, gathering them all together to really hone in and get the details and kind of areas of concern as it relates to ESGs and emissions reductions and pushing those and educating others on those issues.
That is a very impressive mission, and I have not heard a better mission statement. I think that was one of my first comments to you when I had originally started this journey of connecting with you. Um, Patrick, I will do a did you know about climate change, but I'm interested in changing up that format with you because you have an environmental background and climate change is one of those topics that it is very controversial. It's very politicized. And to be quite honest with you, I did not believe in climate change till I started getting into the power generation side of things. I thought that the earth went in cycles. I was just very uneducated. And so I spent a lot of time educating myself what is going on. Obviously, the world is not going to produce more carbon, but where we displace it is a huge issue and it doesn't do well in the atmosphere. So I just want to know what is your opinion on climate change and what is your stance for it or against
Sure.
it?
When I look at climate change as from the scientific point of view, I think if you hone it down to that, that can give you a great baseline to understand what's going on in our community and in our world. And if you look at, let's start with methane, and then we take methane and we say that it has carbon dioxide equivalent. So what we try to do is bring everything back to the greenhouse gas that we know scientifically is causing climate change. And we look at that rate. And right now, across the industry and across regulators, the factor that we use to correlate methane CO2e to what carbon is varies. So some people believe that it has a 25% correlation, whereas others say that it has an 85 correlation to it. And that obviously, again, that's over a 100-year period. even the EPA uses different numbers depending on the time frame that we're looking at. So when you are doing calculations and you are looking at the effect, how intense or how high that level of effect changes based just on that number that you're using to make the calculation and conversion into CO2e. So we can be way more conservative and err on the side of judgment and make changes that we believe will be quicker and cause less of an impact or reduce emissions more. Or we can obviously use the greater impact number and focus on the near term. When we come back to methane specifically on it, and we look at the change and the effect of that CO2e level over a 10-year period, it's a drastic difference from methane emissions to CO2 straight emissions. So you can reduce the CO2 impact by over 10% by doing it at the methane level. So when I look at climate change and I look at what is going on, there's a lot of things still up in the air in terms of how much needs to be done now, how much needs to be done as we go after the goals that we've set for the 2030 timeframe, as well as the 2050. But there's no doubt that there's an effect on climate change. So in my opinion, anything that you're doing sooner and more accurately makes a better situation as that time increases. So if you can reduce more now and continue on that path of reductions, you're going to have a greater effect on the overall CO2 in the atmosphere. And that will then obviously correlate to better reductions or changes or things getting worse, so to say, in terms of climate change. So I don't think anybody is of the mindset now that it's not real and it's not happening. I think there's a big debate on how fast, how imminent is it over the timeline that we're looking at. And that's kind of the debatable part of it because of the science associated with it. But it's no doubt happening, and it's no doubt something that we need to address and adjust as we're moving forward. And the sooner that we can do it, the better off we'll be in the long run and in the future.
So first off, you just earned a seat at my family's Thanksgiving table because of what you just explained. You need to come in and explain to my very oil and gas minded family, like 3 generations of it, that you can come and try and help walk them through this, because they are still of the mindset. That's why I had the mindset that climate change was not real, is because that's what I grew up in. And so now recognizing through my own research and time that there is an effect and we can have a change on it by emissions reductions, that's where I've come to be. Is I'm very thankful to have been enlightened and trying to help it. And that's where I am very happy to be in the low carbon energy space and generating different energy sources, which do not have carbon emissions associated. So let us get into scope emissions, because that is how they are trying to regulate and trying to measure what your carbon reduction looks like, is through scope emissions, levels 1 through 3. Can you give us an overview on that?
Sure, definitely can. I would say scope 1, scope 2 emissions are very well defined right now through regulatory agencies. The requirements associated with those are very clear in what needs to be reported. It's when we get into those scope 3 emissions where there's a little bit more gray area, there's a little bit more area for interpretation based off regulations. All that being said, I believe here in the near future, all 3 scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are going to be something that we granularize and get more data and information requirements on reporting of that and understanding the whole full picture of that. So after setting the stage, when you look at scope 1 emissions refer directly to the greenhouse gas emissions that originate from that source of energy that is being used or that source operator. So those are things like the combustion of fossil fuels, whether it be gasoline, diesel, natural gas. Those are the emissions from the production that you're doing there. They are also the emissions associated with running your equipment on your site for your operations, as well as the vehicles that you are using. When you get into scope 2 emissions, those are the indirect greenhouse gases that are associated with the consumption or the purchase of that power electricity. And it can also come in the forms of using heat or steam. So obviously someone else upstream has used that energy form to create power, and then they are selling it to you and you're using it to operate your compressor at your natural gas plant to move natural gas through your pipeline. So that scope 2 emissions is the emissions associated with the power that you use to move that product in the pipeline. When we get into scope 3 emissions, again, it's a little bit broader, and basically they are all the others emissions that are associated with the indirect greenhouse gas emissions that occur as a result of that company's activities that are not covered under your scope 1 or 2. So really depending on what your company is doing, where you're at in the process, your scope 3 emissions could be someone else's scope 2 emissions, or those scope 3 emissions are so far down the chain in terms of the use that they're a little bit harder to identify and define. All that being said, like I said, we're getting more clarity on it. Regulators are really digging into how we're going to define these, where we want to put the markers at, and how we want operators to kind of input all that information. So like a few examples of scope 3 emissions are like the transportation of the raw materials to your facility to support the main manufacturing that you're doing there. Or it could be the extraction emissions, so that a rig is using to pull natural gas from the ground that then transports it to a refining or processing. And they are then the scope 3 emissions associated with that person down the line that is manufacturing something off of the CO2 stream.
Even more minute. So to give you clarity on where this information is coming from, is what we help produce at Worley is when you're talking about decarbonization pathways for customers, is you are helping them analyze their scope emissions and coming up with a plan in order to help decarbonize those. But I mean, we've even seen something as granular as the logistics surrounding getting solar panels out to the field coming off of the trucks. That is a scope 3 emission. So trying to fully encompass and measure scope emissions is extremely difficult, like you said. So I'm happy to hear that they're becoming even more granular. I haven't spent enough space there to recognize that, but that's good news. So now that we've laid out emissions and reductions, I want to talk about what is going on in the midstream space, specifically around pipelines, because I know Project Canary does sensors in order to help make sure that emissions are not happening along pipelines. But what else is going on within the midstream space to help with this effort?
Yep. So to preface that, I would say The operations and the focus on upstream assets, so the actual production, there's a ton of emphasis put there on defining and tying methane carbon intensities to the production of oil and natural gas. And then when you're using that, as Project Canary kind of coined the term responsibly sourced gas, RSG, which has shown to be very beneficial and very kind of sought after in terms of the market, both for kind of ESG relations, but also obviously on emissions reductions, and communicating that to the public. It's very easy to understand the correlation between responsible operations during the extraction process of producing that fuel. When you get into the midstream space, that's when we're talking about the transportation, whether it be gas gathering in a single state or the transportation of that gas across state lines, moving it to different markets. And then it goes to the utilities, city gates, end users, manufacturers for actual use. Right now, they are looking at that upstream gas that is sourced and saying, hey, is this responsibly sourced? We want responsibly sourced gas. Therefore, we want to get that gas to our end user for consumption, because now there's a lot of pressure from those people, whether it's end users or manufacturing sites that have their own ESG goals, that recognize that they can get those goals and meet those goals if they're using responsibly sourced gas. So in the midstream space, what we're seeing is that there is now an emphasis in understanding, I would say that's probably key, in that RSG gas that has been produced at the wellhead has to go through a lot of processes to get to that end point. And if it's going through a system that has not gone through an assessment or is not doing responsible operations, can you still say that that gas has been responsibly sourced when it gets to the end user? So the midstream space is really getting on board, and it's also driven by the end user to have all those assets verified and assessed to show that they are doing responsible operations. They have designed it properly. They are reducing their emissions along that process, and they're doing the things that they should be doing anyway to help their emission reductions and adding value to that product as it moves through the value chain. So there's a lot of movement in the midstream space where it's becoming more understood across all different parties in the importance of responsible operations in that midstream space.
I want to have a brainstorming session with you outside of this podcast, because what you're telling me right now is that we have been able to take a gas molecule and increase its value by making it more sustainable, but it's the same molecule. So people are willing to pay more because it's environmentally sourced. Well, the same thing is going on with green hydrogen in general right now. Is what we are trying to express is that, yes, the blue hydrogen molecule is the exact same molecule as a green hydrogen, but we have to show the value and help build that business case for people to want to pay more for the green hydrogen molecule until it becomes more affordable, kind of on the same scale as blue hydrogen. So I want to pick your brain on that. Maybe you and I can have that as an external conversation.
Definitely. Yeah, I think it aligns right there with the same concepts and gets the same goal, pushes the same things, and it is very similar.
Okay. So it sounds like upstream and midstream are becoming much more heightenedly aware that they're actually going as far as creating environmentally sourced gas. Let's talk about like coming from the pipeline realm and stepping into Project Canary. You obviously saw the value of emissions reduction, but what is it that if you could share with everybody who is in that industry now, why it is so important that we continue to change our operations to adapt these new emission reductions?
Yeah, I would say that with all the operations that we're doing and with the industry as a whole, when I look at operations in the industry here in the United States, I honestly think the United States oil and gas industry does a phenomenal job at what we are trying to accomplish with reducing emissions, all greenhouse gas emissions, and being environmentally responsible, especially when you compare that to the rest of the world and you look at those high generating percentage of CO2 emitters out there globally. So, number one, I think our industry is doing great. Do we have room to improve? Definitely. And I think with the advancements in technologies, the capability to do continuous monitoring, quantification, real-time measurement and analysis, real-time alerts that are out there and capable of being implemented into these projects, both new ones coming on and existing ones, it gives us a better opportunity to reduce those emissions even more. And the reason I say all of that is because there's plenty of goals that are set out there globally, whether it's OGMP 2.0, which is the voluntary ones, or even if you look at the goals set out there by the Paris Accord and the goal to reduce the increase of temperature by 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius over up till 2050. In order to meet those goals globally, we have to improve and we have to implement new technologies, new capabilities into what we're already doing well to make a more efficient system to meet those goals. We're not going to meet those goals as a world if we do not take our part and add into where we can in integrating those technologies and capabilities. So that's why I think it's very important in the midstream space that we get on board and support that and continue to develop that process.
Patrick, I don't know if you know Adam Murray, but we had a really good conversation last week. And what we even decided above and beyond the environmental side is that the true value proposition for emission reductions is you're not losing product anymore. And product is what? Product is money. So if you're able to sustainably, run operations and reduce emissions, you're also keeping money in your lines and money in your space of delivery. So I thought that was a really good one to make sure everybody understands that this is not just environmental, it's also dollars as well. So Patrick, this is one of the last questions I have for you. It is, when it comes down to the future of pipelines, let's face it, we are going to be experiencing an increase in CO2 lines, increase in hydrogen lines. I was even introduced to the concept of batching as a possibility where you could run multiple products through lines. Like, what do you see as the future for this? How is that industry preparing for all of these new types of lines? Well, not new types, but expanding those types of lines.
Yeah, I think the future's bright. There's lots of opportunities and lots of development out there. The infrastructure that we currently have in the United States, it's great, but it's not complete. And there's definitely new areas that we need to connect to existing areas, especially when we kind of look at the hub and spoke model of CO2 gathering, both hydrogen integrated into that as well, and getting that product to where it needs to be used for manufacturing. Even when looking at those production facilities, capture facilities, getting the product to where it needs to be sequestered for CO2 operations. The infrastructure that we need, we don't have it, or it's not in the right areas where we need it. So we need to have projects and operations over the next few years here to start building that infrastructure to support our goals and what we're trying to do in terms of emissions reduction goals. So there's going to be a ton of new projects that I see coming up here in the near future. And with that, I think integrating in new technologies, new monitors, the digital platform and real-time analysis, the opportunity to do it better than we've done it in the past, the opportunity to design more robust systems that have less of an impact, both in building them as well as operating them, is only going to grow. Even when you look at LNG and we look at the amount of LNG that is being exported from this country and going to other countries, whether it be Europe or South America or Asia, we're seeing a big drive in requirements for low emissions associated with that, or low carbon ratings associated with that. Over 70% of the LNG exporters have already agreed and support OGM 0.2. So with that, that's going to increase the need for exporting that. It's going to increase the need to continue to refine and support and reduce emissions. So like we said, it's a win-win. You keep more in the pipeline, you keep the emissions lower, and it supports the whole chain. Especially with CO2, I would also say the sequestration part of everything that we're doing in the CO2 sequestration, whether they're class 2 or class 6 wells, and we're looking at long-term permanent storage with over 100 years of monitoring to ensure the permanence of that, and the relation to hydrogen, ethanol, natural gas productions, and the needs to reduce their footprints, but also capture the CO2 and sequester it in a permanent way is amazing. Like, it supports everything that we're trying to accomplish. It aligns with the goals that both the companies as well as the nation is setting. And it really answers that question that the public wants to know. They want to know if their fuel, their energy has been created and processed cleanly. They want it to be reliable, and they want it to be affordable. And I think when you integrate all those methods into it and look at the full interactions between all the different sides of the industry as a whole, they support each other to achieve those goals.
Patrick, Project Canary is so lucky to have you. And I think this industry is so lucky to have you. And after speaking with you, I can just truly tell that you're in your zone of genius. And I'm thankful that Alan connected us, because I can't wait to continue to follow you and see your journey and the impact that you're having on this space. And I just thank you so much for your time on elemental energy and sharing this and helping educating both of our audiences, both the conventional side and the low carbon side. This is what this is all about, is bridging the conventional mindset with the low carbon way of thinking. And I think we did an excellent job on this podcast. So everybody stay happy, stay safe. And Patrick, do you want to close us out?
I just wanted to say thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about all the great stuff that Project Canary and myself are doing in the industry, and kind of sharing the great news, sharing the good efforts that our industry as a whole is doing. And I think we're going to go after it and get it. So keep up the good work, and thank you for everything that you do with this podcast.
Thank you all so much for listening today. If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe so you're notified every time a podcast is released. Find Elemental Energy on Facebook and connect with me, Marsha Leonard, on LinkedIn. But lastly, and most importantly, share this podcast with your family and your friends, especially if you are in the energy industry and you're having an influence on the path of decarbonization. I'm on this journey figuring things out, and I want you guys to come along. So the closer I can get to you and the more I can connect with you, the better this show will be and become.